Could you survive a night alone when something ancient starts calling you by name? 7 true Appalachian encounters that left survivors permanently changed, unable to speak about what they witnessed. What hunts those remote hollows doesn't follow natural law. Rescue teams found cabins with doors locked from the inside. Survivors discovered claw marks on their own skin with no memory of how they got there. These stories were buried for decades until the survivors finally broke their silence. What they experienced will haunt you long after tonight. I never believed in anything supernatural until I spent 3 nights alone in my grandfather's old cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains. This happened last October, and I still can't sleep without checking every window in my house twice before bed. My grandfather passed away that summer, and he left me his hunting cabin in his will. The place was about 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a dirt road that turned into mud whenever it rained. I decided to spend a long weekend there, cleaning it out and deciding whether to keep it or sell it. I arrived just before sunset on a Friday. The cabin was smaller than I remembered from childhood visits. Just one main room with a fireplace, a tiny bedroom, and an outhouse about 20 yards into the woods. The air inside smelled like old wood and dust. I swept the floors, started a fire, and made myself some dinner on the old cast-iron stove. Everything was fine until around 10 that night. I was sitting by the fire reading one of the old books from my grandfather's shelf when I heard it. 3 knocks on the front door. Not loud, but deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. I got up and opened the door, expecting maybe a ranger or a lost hiker. Nobody was there. Just darkness and the sound of wind moving through the trees. I shined my flashlight around the porch and the clearing beyond. Nothing. I went back inside, feeling uneasy but telling myself it was probably a branch hitting the door in the wind. Except there was no branch near the door, and the knocking had been too rhythmic, too purposeful. 20 minutes later, it happened again. 3 knocks. Same pattern, same intensity. Knock, knock, knock. This time I yanked the door open immediately. Still nothing. But as I stood there in the doorway, I heard something that made my blood run cold. From somewhere in the woods to my left, I heard 3 knocks again, like something was knocking on a tree trunk. Knock, knock, knock. I slammed the door and locked it. My hands were shaking as I pushed an old chair against it for extra measure. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just the woods playing tricks on me. The Appalachian forest is full of strange sounds. Everyone knows that. But then I heard it from the back of the cabin. 3 knocks on the bedroom window. Knock, knock, knock. I grabbed my grandfather's old hunting knife from above the fireplace and slowly walked toward the bedroom. The knocking stopped. I stood there for what felt like an hour, just listening. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then it started moving around the cabin. 3 knocks on the east wall. A minute of silence. 3 knocks on the west wall. Another pause. 3 knocks on the roof, right above my head. This went on for over an hour. Whatever was out there was circling the cabin, knocking in that same pattern. Always 3 times. Always the same rhythm. Never faster, never slower. I sat in the corner of the main room with the knife in my hand, watching the door and windows. Around midnight, the knocking finally stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound itself. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there until dawn, and as soon as there was enough light to see, I packed my things and got ready to leave. I was done with this place. But when I opened the front door, I froze. There were marks on the porch, not footprints. These were long, deep scratches in the wood, like something with claws had been standing right there. And they led from the porch steps to the door, then around the side of the cabin, following the exact path the knocking had taken. I followed the scratch marks with my eyes, tracing them as they went around the corner of the cabin. My curiosity overrode my fear for just a moment, and I stepped off the porch to see where they led. The marks circled the entire cabin. Whatever made them had walked around the structure multiple times, stopping at each wall, each window. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the scratches were too high off the ground. They started about 5 feet up the wall, as if whatever made them was tall. Very tall. I was throwing my bag into my truck when I noticed something else. On the driver's side door, there were 3 deep scratches, fresh ones. They hadn't been there yesterday. My truck had been parked about 15 feet from the cabin. That thing had come over to my vehicle. It had touched it. I got out of there as fast as I could, the truck bouncing violently over the rough dirt road. I didn't care. I just wanted to put distance between myself and that cabin. But here's the thing that still haunts me. As I was driving away, I glanced in my rearview mirror one last time. Standing at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the early morning fog, was a figure. It was impossibly tall and thin, with arms that hung down past where its knees should have been. And as I watched, it raised one of those long arms and knocked 3 times against a tree trunk. I didn't go back. I couldn't. I hired someone from town to clean out the cabin and put it on the market. The real estate agent called me 2 weeks later, frustrated. She said every time she tried to show the property, potential buyers would leave within minutes. They all said the same thing. They felt like they were being watched. One couple claimed they heard knocking coming from inside the walls. The cabin is still for sale. It's been almost a year now, and the price has dropped 3 times. Sometimes the agent sends me pictures of the property to update the listing. In one of the photos she sent last month, I noticed something in the background that made me delete her number and block her emails. There were scratches on the outhouse door, 3 deep gouges in the wood, and they weren't there when I left. Whatever is at that cabin, it's still there, still knocking, still circling, and I think it's waiting for someone to come back. Last week, I got a call from an unknown number. I shouldn't have answered it, but I did. There was no voice on the other end. Just 3 sounds in the background, clear as day. Knock, knock, knock. I hung up immediately and changed my phone number the next day. But 2 nights ago, I woke up at 3 in the morning to a sound that made me go completely cold. 3 knocks on my bedroom window. I live on the 2nd floor of an apartment building in the city, 4 hours away from those mountains. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't look. I pulled the covers over my head like a child and waited for morning. When the sun came up, I finally got the courage to check the window. There were no marks, no scratches, nothing. But on the outside ledge, which should be impossible to reach without a ladder, there was a small pile of leaves and dirt. Mountain dirt. The red clay kind you only find in Appalachia. I moved out of that apartment 3 days ago. I'm staying with a friend now, and I haven't told him why I needed a place so urgently. How could I explain it? How could I tell him that something followed me back from those mountains, and it knows the knocking pattern is what scares me most? Last night, my friend mentioned he heard something weird around 3 in the morning. He said it sounded like someone knocking on the walls. He asked if I heard it too. I lied and said no, but I did hear it. 3 knocks, slow and deliberate, and they were getting closer to his bedroom door where I'm sleeping on the floor. I don't think distance matters to this thing. I don't think walls matter either, and I'm terrified of what happens when it finally stops knocking and decides to come inside. I need to tell someone about what I found in the root cellar of my aunt's cabin, even though nobody will believe me. Even though saying it out loud makes it more real, and I've been trying so hard to convince myself it wasn't. My Aunt Clara lived alone in a cabin in eastern Kentucky, deep in the Appalachian wilderness. She was one of those tough mountain women who could hunt, fish, and survive anything. When she had a stroke last April, I volunteered to stay at her cabin and take care of her property while she recovered in a nursing home in town. The cabin was old, built sometime in the 1920s, with a root cellar dug into the hillside behind it. Aunt Clara had always kept it stocked with preserves, potatoes, and canned goods. Before I arrived, she gave me specific instructions. Feed the chickens, check the water pump, keep the fire going, and whatever I do, make sure the root cellar door stays locked. That last instruction seemed odd, but I didn't question it. Aunt Clara had her ways. I settled in easily enough. The cabin was cozy, and I enjoyed the peace and quiet. Every few days, I'd need something from the root cellar. Aunt Clara had given me the key on a heavy iron ring. The cellar door was thick wood, reinforced with metal bands, and it had 2 locks on it. That also seemed like overkill for a storage space, but again, I didn't think much of it. The first few times I went down there, everything was normal. Stone steps leading down into a cool, dark space, shelves lined with mason jars, bins of root vegetables, a damp, earthy smell. I'd grab what I needed and leave, making sure to lock both locks behind me. But on my 5th day there, I noticed something strange. I had gone down to get some canned beans, and as I was looking through the shelves, I heard a sound. A soft scratching noise coming from the back wall of the cellar. The back wall was just dirt and stone, part of the hillside itself. I stood very still and listened. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Probably a mole or some other animal burrowing on the other side, I told myself. The mountain was full of wildlife. I grabbed my beans and left, locking up behind me. That night I called Aunt Clara at the nursing home to check on her. We chatted about her recovery, and then I casually mentioned the scratching sound in the cellar. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You keep that door locked," she finally said. Her voice had an edge to it I'd never heard before. "Both locks. You hear me? And don't go down there after dark." "Aunt Clara, what's—" "Promise me," she interrupted. "Promise me you'll keep it locked and stay out after dark." I promised, more confused than ever. After we hung up, I sat by the fire, trying to make sense of her reaction. She'd sounded genuinely frightened, which wasn't like her at all. I kept my promise for 2 more days. I only went to the cellar during daylight, and I always made sure both locks were secured. But the scratching sound was getting louder, and it was happening more frequently. On the 3rd night, I woke up around 2 in the morning to a sound that made my heart stop. Someone was unlocking the cellar door. I could hear it clearly through the cabin's back window, the scrape of metal on metal, the click of the first lock opening, then the second. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window. From there, I had a clear view of the cellar door built into the hillside about 20 feet from the cabin. The door was opening. Slowly, inch by inch, it was swinging outward, but I couldn't see anyone opening it. The door just moved on its own, creaking on its old hinges. My mouth went dry. I wanted to look away, to hide under the blankets, but I couldn't move. I just stood there watching. Something came out of the cellar. At first, it looked like a person crawling on all 4s, but as it emerged fully into the moonlight, I realized it was wrong. All wrong. Its limbs were too long, bent at angles that weren't natural. The way it moved was jerky and wrong, like it was learning how to use its body. It stayed low to the ground, and even in the darkness, I could see that its skin was pale, almost gray. Then it lifted its head and looked directly at my window. I dropped to the floor immediately, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. I pressed my back against the wall and tried to control my breathing. Maybe it hadn't seen me. Maybe it was looking at something else. I waited there on the floor for what felt like hours but was probably only 10 minutes. Finally, I got the courage to peek over the windowsill. The thing was gone. The cellar door stood wide open, a black rectangle carved into the hillside. I didn't see the creature anywhere in the clearing. That's when I heard the sound that still gives me nightmares. Footsteps on the cabin's back porch. Slow, dragging footsteps, and then scratching on the back door. The same scratching sound I'd heard coming from inside the cellar wall. It was right outside. I crawled away from the window as quietly as I could and grabbed the fireplace poker. It was the only weapon I had. The scratching continued, patient and persistent. Then it moved to the window. I could hear fingernails or claws dragging across the glass. I knew the door was locked, but I wasn't sure that would matter. Whatever this thing was, it had unlocked the cellar door from the inside. 2 heavy locks that should have been impossible to open from that side. For 3 hours it circled the cabin, scratching at windows, testing the doors. Sometimes I'd hear it on the roof, moving around up there with that same uneven, crawling gait. I sat in the corner of the main room with the poker in my hands, shaking, praying for sunrise. When the first light of dawn came through the windows, the sound stopped. I waited another hour before I dared to move. When I finally looked outside, the cellar door was closed again. I should have left right then, packed my things and driven away and never come back. But I needed to know what that thing was. I needed to understand. I waited until full daylight, then I took the key and walked to the cellar. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. Both locks were engaged, locked from the outside just as I'd left them. I opened the door and went down the steps slowly, the poker still in my hand. Everything looked normal. Shelves, jars, bins of vegetables. But I walked to the back wall where I'd heard the scratching. There was a hole, not a small hole. A tunnel, really. It had been hidden behind some old burlap sacks that were now pushed aside. The opening was about 3 feet wide, disappearing back into the darkness of the hillside. I knelt down and shined my flashlight into it. The tunnel went back at least 15 feet before curving out of sight. The walls were dirt, but they'd been dug out deliberately, carefully, and there were marks on the walls. Scratch marks, like something had been digging from the inside out. That's when I saw them, scattered on the ground near the tunnel entrance. Bones. Small ones, like from rabbits or squirrels, but also larger ones. I'm not an expert, but some of them looked human. I backed away from the tunnel and ran up the steps. I locked both locks with shaking hands and went straight to the cabin. I called Aunt Clara. "There's a tunnel," I said as soon as she answered. "In the cellar." "What is it? What was I supposed to be keeping locked in?" Another long silence. "You saw it, didn't you?" She finally whispered. "You saw what lives in there. What is it?" "My sister," she said quietly. "Your Aunt Margaret. She disappeared into those mountains 40 years ago, and she came back wrong, changed. We kept her fed, kept her locked up. It was the kindest thing we could do. She's family." I felt sick. "That thing is not human anymore, Aunt Clara." "She's blood," she said firmly. "And now she knows you. She'll be hungry again in a few days. Make sure you leave something for her, and keep those locks secure." I left that same day. I didn't leave food. I didn't do anything except drive away as fast as I could. Aunt Clara died 2 weeks later. Another stroke. The cabin is mine now, legally. But I'll never go back. Though sometimes, late at night, I wonder if anyone is feeding what's in that cellar. And I wonder what happens when something that hungry decides to dig a new tunnel, one that leads somewhere other than an old root cellar in the middle of nowhere. Last month, there was a news report about missing hikers in that area. 3 people vanished without a trace. The search area was within 5 miles of Aunt Clara's cabin. I found a journal that was never meant to be read, and now I understand why some things should stay lost in the mountains. Last September, I rented a cabin in the Appalachian Mountains for a solo hiking trip. The cabin was listed on one of those vacation rental websites, cheap and secluded, exactly what I wanted. The owner mentioned it had been vacant for a while and apologized in advance for any dust or cobwebs. When I arrived, the place looked decent enough. A small 2-room cabin with a loft bedroom accessed by a ladder. The furniture was old but sturdy, and there was a wood-burning stove that still worked. I dropped my bags and started unpacking. That's when I found the journal. It was wedged between the bed frame and the wall in the loft, like it had fallen back there and been forgotten. A standard brown leather hiking journal, the kind outdoor enthusiasts use to document their trails. I opened it, thinking maybe it belonged to a previous renter, and I should contact the owner about returning it. The first entry was dated April 14th, 2 years ago. Day 1 at the cabin. The trail up here was harder than I expected, but the isolation is perfect. No cell service, no internet, just me in the mountains. Exactly what I need to clear my head after everything that happened. I plan to stay for 2 weeks. The handwriting was neat, controlled. The entries continued normally for the first few days. The hiker, who never mentioned his name, wrote about the trails he explored, the wildlife he saw, and how therapeutic the solitude was. But on day 4, the tone shifted. I keep hearing footsteps on the porch at night. Heavy footsteps like someone pacing back and forth. When I check, there's never anyone there. Probably just a bear or deer. I need to stop being paranoid. Day 5. The footsteps again last night, but this time I heard something else. Breathing. Right outside the door. Deep, raspy breathing, like someone who'd been running. I sat in the dark with my knife, too scared to turn on a light. It lasted for maybe 20 minutes, then stopped. In the morning I found handprints on the window. Human handprints, but I'm alone up here. I know I'm alone. My stomach tightened as I read. I glanced at the window near the bed, half expecting to see prints there. Day 6. I tried to leave today. Packed all my gear and headed down the trail toward my car. But after an hour of hiking, I ended up back at the cabin. That's impossible. I know the trail. I've hiked my whole life. I know how to use a compass. But somehow I walked in a complete circle. I tried again, same result. It's like the mountain won't let me leave. Day 7. I saw it last night, standing at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the porch light. It looked like a person at first, but it was too tall, maybe 7 feet, with arms that hung down to its knees. It just stood there watching the cabin. I watched it through the window for hours. It never moved, never blinked. When the sun started to rise, it stepped back into the trees and disappeared. My hands were shaking now. I should have stopped reading. I should have thrown the journal away and left the cabin immediately, but I kept turning pages. Day 8. It's getting closer. Last night it was on the porch. I could hear the wood creaking under its weight. I pushed the furniture against the door. It didn't try to come in. It just waited out there until dawn. I found tracks this morning. Footprints, but wrong. The toes are too long, and there are too many of them. Day 9. I'm running out of food. I tried to leave again. Same thing happened. Walked for 3 hours in a straight line and ended up at the cabin. It's doing this. Whatever that thing is, it's keeping me here. I don't know what it wants. Day 10. It spoke to me last night. I stared at those words, my heart pounding. The entry continued. It spoke with my voice. Standing on the porch in the dark, it called out using my voice. It said my name. It said, "Let me in. I'm so cold out here. Please let me in." Hearing my own voice coming from that thing was the most horrifying experience of my life. I didn't respond. I just sat in the corner with my hands over my ears until it stopped. Day 11. It knows things about me, personal things. It talked again last night, still using my voice. It mentioned my daughter's name, my ex-wife, the accident that I came here to forget, things nobody else could know. How does it know these things? How is this possible? Day 12. I'm not alone in here anymore. I know that sounds crazy. I'm the only person in this cabin. But I keep seeing someone in my peripheral vision, a shadow moving in the loft, a figure standing in the corner. When I look directly, nothing's there, but I can feel it. Something is inside with me now. Day 13. The thing outside looks more like me every night. I saw it clearly through the window. It's taken my shape, my face. It stands there, naked and smiling, and it looks exactly like me, like looking in a mirror. It waves at me sometimes. Last night it pressed its face against the glass and mouthed the words, "Let me in." Day 14. I understand now. It doesn't want to hurt me. It wants to be me. It wants my life, my identity, everything I am. And I think it's working. When I look in the mirror, I barely recognize myself. I look pale, thin, faded, like I'm being erased. Meanwhile, the thing outside looks more solid, more real. It's wearing clothes now. My clothes, clothes that should be in my bag. Day 15. Final entry. If anyone finds this, don't stay in this cabin. Don't even come looking for me. I'm going to try to leave one more time, but I don't think I'm getting out of here. I think this is where I end, where I become something else, or nothing at all. The thing outside is me now. I watched it practice my walk, my mannerisms, my expressions. It's perfect, and I'm fading. I can barely hold this pen. The entry ended there. The rest of the pages were blank. I sat in the loft for a long moment, the journal trembling in my hands. Then I heard it. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy footsteps, pacing back and forth, exactly like the journal described. I scrambled down the ladder and went to the window. Nothing was there. But when I turned around, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. On the table next to my hiking gear was a piece of paper I hadn't left there. Written in shaky handwriting were the words, "It's your turn now." I grabbed my keys and ran for the door. I didn't pack. I didn't think. I just ran to my car and drove down the mountain road as fast as I could. But here's what haunts me. Here's the part I've never told anyone. As I was driving away, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw someone standing on the cabin's porch. They were too far away to see clearly, but they were waving at me, and they looked exactly like me. I made it home that day. I've tried to convince myself it was just fear and imagination, that the journal was a prank and the footsteps were just an animal. But 2 weeks ago, something happened that I can't explain away. I got a call from the cabin's owner. She said another guest had just checked out early, terrified. They'd found a journal hidden in the cabin, a journal that documented their stay, day by day, even though they'd only been there for 2 days. She read me the last entry over the phone. It looks like the previous guest now. It has his face. But sometimes late at night I see two of them standing at the edge of the trees, the new one and the old one. They're both watching the cabin, both waiting. I hung up and immediately checked my closet, counting my clothes. I do this every day now, because I'm missing a shirt and a pair of jeans, the same ones I was wearing at that cabin. And 3 nights ago, my neighbor mentioned seeing someone who looked exactly like me standing in my backyard at 3 in the morning, just standing there, staring at my bedroom window. When he called out, the figure ran into the woods behind my house. I don't go outside after dark anymore. I keep all my curtains closed, and I've started documenting everything in my own journal, just in case. Just in case I start to fade and something else starts to become me. The worst part? Sometimes when I look in the mirror, I swear my reflection moves a second too slow. Like it's learning. Like it's not quite me yet, but it's getting closer. There are 6 windows in my uncle's hunting cabin, and I know this because I had to cover every single one of them before I could feel safe enough to close my eyes. I'm a photographer, and last November I decided to spend a week at my uncle's cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains to capture the late autumn landscape. He hadn't used the place in years and was happy to let me stay there. He gave me the keys, showed me how to work the generator, and told me to enjoy the peace and quiet. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, beautiful during the day, but unsettling at night when the trees became a wall of darkness pressing in from all sides. The first evening, I made dinner and edited some photos I'd taken during the day. Around 9 o'clock, I realized I hadn't closed the curtains. I walked to the front window to pull the drapes shut, and that's when I saw it. A face, just for a split second. Pale and wide-eyed, staring in at me from the darkness. I jumped back, my heart racing. When I looked again, there was nothing there, just my own reflection in the glass and the black forest beyond. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, my own face reflected back at me, distorted by the old glass. But I closed all the curtains anyway, in every room, before I went to bed. That night, I woke up to a tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window above my bed. Slow, deliberate taps, like someone knocking with a fingernail. I lay there frozen, staring up at the curtain. The tapping continued for maybe a minute, then stopped. I didn't look. I pulled the blanket over my head and waited for morning. When the sun came up, I checked outside. The window was at least 8 feet off the ground. There was no ladder, no tree branches close enough to reach it, nothing that would explain the tapping. I spent that day hiking and taking photos, trying not to think about it. But as the sun started to set, I felt a growing sense of dread about returning to the cabin. I got back just before dark, and the first thing I noticed made my stomach drop. One of the curtains was open. The front window curtain that I distinctly remembered closing the night before was pulled wide open. I stood outside for a moment, staring at that dark window, half expecting to see someone staring back. The cabin was locked. I'd locked it that morning. No one could have gotten inside, unless they were already in there. I unlocked the door slowly, my hands shaking. I searched every room, every closet, even under the bed. Nothing. I was alone. The curtain must have just slipped open somehow. But curtains don't open themselves. I closed it again, making sure it was secure this time. I made dinner, trying to act normal, trying to convince myself everything was fine. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Around 10 that night, I was reading in bed when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I could track their progress by sound alone. They started at the front porch, then moved along the east side of the cabin, then the back, then the west side. A complete circle. Then they started again. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. I'd known there wouldn't be. The cabin was too remote. The footsteps stopped at each window as they passed, and at each window, I heard that same tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Whatever was out there was checking each window systematically, like it was looking for a way in. I got out of bed and went to the main room, grabbing a knife from the kitchen. The footsteps continued their circuit around the cabin. When they reached the front window, they stopped. Everything went silent. I stood there in the darkness, holding my breath, waiting. Then I heard a new sound that made my blood run cold. The doorknob was turning. Slowly, quietly, someone was trying to open the front door. The lock held, but the doorknob kept turning back and forth, testing it. Then it stopped. More silence. I waited for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, I got the courage to peek through the front curtain. Someone was standing in the clearing, about 20 feet from the cabin. It was too dark to make out details, but I could see the silhouette, tall and motionless, facing the cabin, facing me. I dropped the curtain and backed away from the window. My mind was racing. Who was this? What did they want? The nearest neighbor was miles away. No one should be out here. I stayed away from the windows for the rest of the night, sitting in the corner of the main room with the knife in my lap. The generator hummed in the background, the only sound. Whatever had been outside seemed to be gone. When dawn finally came, I packed my things immediately. I was leaving. I didn't care about the photography project or wasting the trip. I just wanted out. But when I opened the door, I stopped. There were muddy footprints on the porch, barefoot prints, like someone had been walking in the wet soil and then stood on my porch. They led from the steps to the front window, where they stopped. Whoever it was had been standing there, looking in. The prints were strange, though. The toes were too long, and they were spaced wrong, like the feet didn't quite match human proportions. I loaded my car quickly, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip my camera bag. I was throwing the last bag in the trunk when I noticed something on my car window. A handprint. On the driver's side window. A muddy handprint on the outside of the glass. Someone had been at my car during the night, had touched it, had looked inside. I got in and locked the doors immediately, my skin crawling. As I started the engine, I looked back at the cabin one more time. Every single curtain I had closed was now open. All 6 windows displayed dark, empty glass. And in the front window, I saw movement. Just a shadow pulling back from the glass like someone had been watching me leave. I drove down that mountain road faster than I should have, not caring about the ruts and rocks. I just needed distance between me and that place. I made it home and tried to forget about it. I told myself it was probably just a vagrant or a disturbed person living in the woods. Creepy, but explainable. But then I developed the photos from that trip. I hadn't taken any pictures of the cabin itself, just landscapes. But when I looked through them on my computer, my heart nearly stopped. In one photo, a wide shot of the forest at sunset, you could see the cabin in the far background, just barely visible. And in the front window, there was a figure, a pale, blurred figure standing in the window looking out, looking directly at the camera, directly at where I'd been standing. I was alone in that cabin. I know I was alone. I zoomed in on the image, enhancing it as much as I could. The figure was thin, impossibly thin, with dark hollow eyes and a too wide smile. And the worst part was its hands. They were pressed against the glass from the inside, and the fingers were too long, just like the footprints. I deleted the photo immediately, but the image is burned into my memory. I called my uncle to tell him about the experience, to warn him that someone might be squatting at his cabin. He listened quietly, then said something that made my hands go numb. "Did you see its face clearly?" he asked. "What? I mean, not in person, just in the photo. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "I stopped using that cabin 5 years ago. I had the same experience you did, something watching from outside. But on my last night there, I saw it up close, pressed against the bedroom window. That face, those eyes. I've never been back since. Why didn't you tell me? My voice was shaking, because I thought maybe it was just me. Maybe I was losing my mind. But if you saw it too, he trailed off. Don't go back there. Whatever that thing is, it's still there, still waiting. I promised him I wouldn't, and I meant it. But here's what I can't stop thinking about, what keeps me up at night. Last week I was in my apartment in the city, 3 hours away from those mountains. I was getting ready for bed when I walked past my bedroom window. I live on the 4th floor, and I never close my curtains because no one can see in. But that night, something made me look outside. There was a face pressed against the glass, the same pale, hollow-eyed face from the photo, staring in at me with that too wide smile. On the 4th floor, where nothing should be able to reach. I screamed and fell backward. When I looked again, it was gone. But on the outside of the window there were smudges, handprints, with fingers too long to be human. I keep my curtains closed now, all of them, in every room, and I've covered the windows with blankets for extra measure. Because sometimes late at night I still hear it, tap, 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 and I know it followed me home. I never believed in the old stories about the Appalachian Mountains. You know the ones. Warnings passed down through generations about things that live in the hollows, things that watch from the tree line. I thought they were just tales to scare kids away from wandering too far into the woods. But after what happened at that cabin in October of 2023, I don't go near those mountains anymore. And I never will again. My name is David, and I'm a freelance writer. Last fall, I was struggling with a deadline for my novel and desperate for inspiration. A friend of mine, Marcus, told me about his family's old hunting cabin deep in the Appalachian wilderness of eastern Kentucky. He said it was isolated, quiet, and had no cell service or internet. Perfect for writing, he claimed. He offered to let me stay there for a week, completely alone. I jumped at the opportunity. The drive up was beautiful. October had painted the mountains in shades of orange and red, and the air smelled like pine and damp earth. But the further I drove down that winding gravel road, the more uneasy I felt. The trees grew thicker, pressing in on both sides like they were trying to swallow the path. Eventually, I reached the cabin just before sunset. It was a small, weathered structure with a stone chimney and a covered porch. The wood was dark with age, and moss clung to the north side. Marcus had told me the cabin had been in his family since the 1940s, and it looked every bit of its age. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and headed inside. The interior was basic. One main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area, a bedroom, and a bathroom that barely functioned. There was no electricity, just oil lamps and candles. Marcus had stocked the place with firewood, canned food, and bottled water. I set up my laptop on the wooden table, lit a fire, and settled in for the night. That first evening was peaceful. I wrote for a few hours, made some soup, and listened to the wind moving through the trees. Around 11, I decided to turn in early. The bed was old but comfortable, and I fell asleep quickly to the sound of crickets and distant owls. I woke up around 2 in the morning to complete silence. And I mean complete. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just this heavy, suffocating quiet that pressed down on everything. I lay there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had woken me. Then I heard it, a soft scratching sound. It was coming from the wall next to my bed. At first I thought it might be a raccoon or a squirrel that had gotten into the crawl space, but the scratching was rhythmic, deliberate. 3 slow scrapes, a pause, then 3 more. It went on for maybe 5 minutes before it stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept telling myself it was just an animal, but something about the pattern felt wrong. When morning finally came, I went outside to check the exterior walls. There were no holes, no signs of damage, nothing that would explain the sound. I spent the second day writing and trying to shake off the unease from the night before, but as the sun started to set, that feeling came creeping back. I made dinner, lit the lamps, and tried to focus on my work. Around 10, I decided to step outside for some fresh air. The porch overlooked a clearing that stretched about 50 feet before the forest began. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in pale silver light. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cold October air, when I noticed something at the edge of the tree line. A figure, standing completely still. My heart lurched. I squinted, trying to make out details, but the shadows were too thick. It looked like a person, tall and thin, just standing there facing the cabin. I called out, "Hello, can I help you?" My voice sounded small and weak in the vast darkness. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. I stood there for what felt like forever, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then slowly, the figure took one step backward and disappeared into the trees. I rushed back inside, locked the door, and pushed the table against it. I kept all the lamps burning that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind made me jump. I didn't hear the scratching again, but I barely slept. The next morning, I seriously considered leaving, but I'd driven 4 hours to get there, and I'd promised Marcus I'd stay the week. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably just a hiker or a local who didn't realize anyone was staying at the cabin. I decided to give it one more night. That was a mistake. The third night started the same way. I made dinner, worked on my writing, and tried to ignore the growing dread in my stomach. Around midnight, I was lying in bed when I heard footsteps on the porch. Heavy, deliberate steps that moved from one end to the other, then stopped right in front of the door. I held my breath. Every muscle in my body tensed. The doorknob rattled. Once, twice, then stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the door, my hand shaking so badly the beam danced across the wood. "Who's there?" I shouted. My voice cracked. No answer. Just silence. Then the scratching started again. But this time it wasn't on the wall. It was on the door. 3 slow, deliberate scrapes. A pause. 3 more. Over and over. I don't know how long I sat there frozen, listening to that sound. It could have been 5 minutes or an hour. Time felt distorted, like I was trapped in some nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Finally, the scratching stopped. The footsteps moved across the porch again and faded into the distance. I didn't move from that spot until sunrise. When morning came, I went outside to look at the door. There were marks in the wood. Deep gouges, like something with claws had dragged across it. 3 parallel lines, repeated over and over in a pattern. That's when I decided I was done. I packed my things as quickly as I could and headed for my car, but when I got there, my stomach dropped. All 4 tires were slashed. Long, clean cuts that had left them completely deflated. I stood there in disbelief, my mind racing. I had no cell service. The nearest town was at least 20 miles away. I was stuck. I went back inside the cabin and tried to think. I could walk out, but it would take hours, and I'd have to navigate that winding gravel road in broad daylight. Or I could wait and hope someone drove by, though Marcus had told me almost no one used this road. I decided to wait until afternoon and then start walking. I spent the morning boarding up the windows from the inside using spare planks I found in a shed out back. I reinforced the door as best I could. If I had to spend one more night here, I was going to make damn sure nothing could get in. As the sun began to set again, my anxiety spiked. I kept thinking about that figure at the tree line, the scratching, the slashed tires. Whatever was out there didn't want me to leave. Night fell, and I sat at the table with a kitchen knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other. The fire was roaring, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Every sound made my heart race. The cabin creaked and groaned like it was alive. Around 11, I heard something new. Footsteps again, but this time they were circling the cabin. Slow, measured steps that moved around the entire perimeter. I could track them by the sound. Back porch, north side, front porch, south side, round and round. Then they stopped at the bedroom window, the one I'd boarded up. I heard breathing. Slow, raspy breathing just on the other side of the wood. My entire body went cold. Whatever was out there was so close I could hear every exhale, every inhale. Then it spoke. "Let me in." The voice was wrong. It sounded human but off somehow, like someone imitating speech without fully understanding it. "Let me in." I backed away from the window, gripping the knife so hard my knuckles turned white. "Go away," I screamed. Leave me alone." The breathing stopped. For a moment there was nothing. Then the scratching started on the boarded window. Frantic, aggressive scratching like something was trying to claw its way through. The boards rattled and shook. I ran to the main room and grabbed one of the oil lamps. If that thing got inside, I was going to set the whole damn cabin on fire if I had to. The scratching grew louder, more violent. I could hear the wood splintering. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. I stood there, lamp in hand, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing. I crept toward the bedroom and listened. The breathing was gone. The scratching had stopped. Everything was still. I spent the rest of the night in the main room, sitting with my back against the stone fireplace, knife and lamp ready. I didn't close my eyes once. When dawn finally broke, I grabbed my backpack and left. I didn't care about the rest of my things. I just wanted out. I walked down that gravel road for 3 hours before a truck finally came by. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, gave me a ride to the nearest town. I called Marcus from a gas station and told him everything. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he said, "My grandfather used to tell stories about that cabin. He said something lived in those woods long before we built there. Said it didn't like visitors." Silence. I asked him why the hell he didn't warn me. He said he thought they were just stories, that he'd stayed there dozens of times and never had a problem. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night. When I got back to the cabin with a tow truck to get my car, the tires weren't slashed anymore. They were fine, perfect, like nothing had ever happened. And the scratches on the door, gone. The boards I'd nailed over the window, lying neatly in a pile on the porch. The driver looked at me like I was crazy, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Marcus sold that cabin 2 months later. He won't talk about it, and I don't blame him. As for me, I'll never write another word about the Appalachian Mountains. Some places don't want to be written about. Some things don't want to be known. And whatever is out there in those woods, it's still waiting. I never believed in ghost stories until that night in the Appalachia woods. You know the kind. The ones old folks whisper about around campfires. Tales of things lurking in the mist-shrouded hills that swallow people whole. I'd heard them all my life, growing up on the edge of those mountains in West Virginia, but I figured they were just ways to scare kids straight. That all changed last fall, when my buddy Jake convinced me to join him for a weekend getaway in an old cabin his family owned deep in the Monongahela forest. "Come on, man," he said over the phone. "It's peaceful out there. No cell service, no noise. Just us, some beers and the stars." I laughed it off, but I needed the break from my dead-end job in Charleston. Little did I know, the real horror wasn't in the stories. It was waiting for us. We piled into Jake's beat-up truck that Friday afternoon, the leaves turning that fiery red and orange that makes the Appalachia ridges look like they're on fire. The drive took hours, winding up narrow roads that hugged sheer drops. Fog started rolling in as the sun dipped low, turning the world gray and thick. Jake was all jokes at first, blasting some country tunes, but even he got quiet when the pavement gave way to gravel and the trees closed in like silent sentinels. "This place has been in my family for generations," he said, killing the engine outside the cabin. It squatted there in a small clearing, built from weathered logs that looked like they'd been standing since the Civil War. The roof sagged a bit, and the porch creaked under our boots as we hauled in our gear. No lights on yet, but the windows were dark eyes staring back at us. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and something faintly metallic like old pennies. Jake flipped on a lantern, our only real light source since the power lines didn't reach this far. The place was sparse, a stone fireplace, a rickety table, 2 sagging beds in the loft upstairs, and a kitchenette with a pump sink. We cracked open beers and settled by the fire, the crackle of flames the only sound breaking the heavy silence outside. "Hear that?" Jake asked after a while, his voice low. I listened. Nothing but the wind rustling the pines. "Just the woods settling," I replied, but a chill prickled my skin anyway. We talked late into the night about nothing, work, girls, the usual, until exhaustion hit. I claimed the loft bed, staring at the rafters while Jake snored below. Sleep came slow, the darkness pressing in like a weight. It must have been around midnight when I first heard it. A soft scratching, like nails on wood coming from the walls. I sat up, heart thumping, and listened. Scratch, scratch, pause. Scratch, scratch, pause. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate. "Jake?" I whispered down the stairs. No answer, just his steady breathing. I told myself it was a raccoon or some animal trapped in the chimney. But the sound grew closer now from the floorboards beneath my feet. I swung my legs over the bed, feet dangling into the void of the stairs, and shone my phone's flashlight around. The beam caught dust motes dancing in the air, but nothing else. The scratching stopped. I lay back down, pulse racing, convincing myself I'd imagined it. That's when the whispers started. They were faint at first, like voices carried on the wind, murmuring words I couldn't make out. Female voices, overlapping, urgent. I bolted upright again, straining to hear. "Jake, wake up," I called, louder this time. He grumbled from below. "What the hell, man? It's the middle of the night. You hear that? Talking like women." He laughed sleepily. "You're losing it already? Probably coyotes or something. Go back to sleep." But I couldn't. The whispers grew clearer, weaving through the cracks in the walls. "Come, closer, help us." My mouth went dry. I grabbed the lantern and crept downstairs, the wooden steps groaning under my weight. The fire had died to embers, casting long shadows that twisted like fingers across the room. Jake was sitting up now, rubbing his eyes. "Okay, fine, let's check it out." We stepped onto the porch, the cold air biting through our shirts. The forest was a black wall around us, the fog thicker now, muffling everything. No whispers outside, just the drip of moisture from the eaves and the distant hoot of an owl. "See? Nothing," Jake said, clapping me on the shoulder. We went back in, but the unease lingered. I barely slept the rest of the night, every creak of the cabin making me jump. By morning, the sun pierced the mist, and the place looked almost normal. We laughed it off over coffee, strong and black from the old percolator. "Cabin fever already," Jake joked. "Tonight'll be better. We'll hike, fish in the creek." I nodded, but deep down, I felt watched. The day passed in a blur of normalcy. We chopped wood for the fire, the axe bites echoing through the trees. The air smelled of pine and earth, crisp and alive. We even caught a few trout in the nearby stream, their scales flashing silver in the shallow water. But as the sun began its descent, painting the sky bloody, that prickling sensation returned. Shadows lengthened, and the woods seemed to lean in closer. Back at the cabin, we grilled the fish over the fire, the sizzle and pop a comforting sound. To roughing it, Jake toasted with his beer. We ate in silence mostly, the day's fatigue settling in. Dusk fell fast in those mountains, and soon the lantern was our only light again. That's when the real nightmare began. We'd just banked the fire when the scratching returned, louder this time from the back wall near the kitchen. It wasn't random anymore. It was clawing, desperate, like something trying to dig its way in. "What the fuck is that?" Jake whispered, his face pale in the lantern glow. We grabbed flashlights and edged toward the sound. The wall was rough-hewn logs, chinked with old mortar that had crumbled in places. The scratching paused, then resumed right behind a loose panel. I reached out, heart pounding like a drum in my chest, and pressed my ear to the wood. The whispers came again, clearer. "Let us out. We've been here so long, cold, so cold." Jake's eyes widened. "This isn't funny. Back away." But curiosity, or stupidity, pulled me closer. I wedged my fingers into the gap and tugged. The panel gave way with a splintering crack, revealing a narrow space between the inner and outer walls. Dust billowed out, thick and choking, carrying that metallic tang stronger now, like blood mixed with rust. Inside, the beam of my flashlight caught something. A hand, pale, skeletal, fingers curled like claws, scraping at the air. It wasn't moving, not anymore, but as the light steadied, I saw more. Bones, tangled in scraps of faded cloth wedged into the crawl space. A whole skeleton, or parts of one, jammed in there like it had been buried alive. I screamed, a raw guttural sound that tore from my throat. Jake yanked me back, slamming the panel shut. Jesus Christ, what is that? We stumbled away, breaths coming in ragged gasps. The whispers had stopped, but the cabin felt alive now, humming with some dark energy. "We gotta get out," I said, grabbing my jacket. Jake nodded, but as we reached the door, it wouldn't budge. The knob turned, but the door stuck fast as if sealed from the outside. Panic clawed at us. We threw our weight against it. Nothing. Windows? Jammed shut, latches rusted in place. "This can't be happening," Jake muttered, pounding on the wood. That's when the cold hit. It started as a draft, seeping from the floorboards, but it wasn't just air. It was icy, bone-chilling, like stepping into a freezer. My breath fogged in front of me, and frost began to form on the walls, creeping like veins across the logs. The lantern flickered, shadows dancing wildly, and then they appeared. Not ghosts in white sheets, but shapes in the mist that poured from the cracks. Women, or what was left of them. 3 of them, translucent, their faces gaunt and hollow-eyed, dresses tattered and stained with what looked like old blood. They glided toward us, hands outstretched, mouths moving in silent pleas. I backed into the corner, my mind screaming that this was a dream, a hallucination from bad fish or carbon monoxide. But the fear was real, a vice squeezing my chest. One of them, the closest, reached for Jake. Her fingers passed through his arm, but he jerked back with a yell, clutching at his skin where red welts bloomed like scratches. "They're real! Oh God, they're real!" The whispers filled the room now, a chorus. "Join us. Trapped forever. The cabin keeps us." I remembered the old stories then, tales of settlers in these woods, women accused of witchcraft during the frontier days, bricked up alive in their homes to silence their curses. Was this cabin one of those? Had Jake's family built over that horror? We fought to escape. Jake smashed a chair against a window, glass shattering in a spray of shards. Cold wind rushed in, but the frames held, warped by time or something worse. The women circled us, their forms solidifying, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I could smell them now. Decay, wet earth, and that metallic bite. One brushed past me and I felt it. A tug, like icy fingers wrapping around my soul, pulling me toward the wall. Visions flashed in my mind. Not mine, but hers. Bricked in alive, screaming as the mortar sealed them away. The darkness eternal, hunger gnawing, years blurring into madness. "No!" I shouted, shaking it off. Jake was on his knees, whispering prayers he hadn't said since we were kids. Hours passed, or was it minutes? Time twisted in that frozen hell. The fire reignited on its own, flames blue and unnatural, casting the women's faces in eerie light. They spoke through Jake's mouth at one point, his voice turning high and pleading. "Free us, or join us." He convulsed, foam at his lips, and I had to pin him down until it passed. Dawn was our only hope. We huddled by the door, chanting nonsense to keep sane, the cold sapping our strength. My fingers went numb, toes aching like they'd shatter. The whispers promised peace if we just gave in, let the walls take us. Finally, as the first gray light filtered through the cracks, the door flew open with a bang. Fresh air flooded in, warm and alive. The women shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, and dissolved into mist, sucked back into the walls. We tumbled out, gasping on the dew-kissed grass, the cabin looming behind us like a predator denied its meal. We ran to the truck, tires spinning on gravel until we hit the main road. Jake drove like a madman, neither of us speaking until we reached civilization. That was months ago. Jake sold the cabin, had it bulldozed actually, but the nightmares haven't stopped. Every night I hear the scratching, feel the cold. And sometimes, in the quiet hours, the whispers call my name. Last week, I found scratches on my wall, faint, but there, leading toward the corner. I know they're not done. The Appalachia woods don't forget, and neither do they. If you're ever tempted to stay in an old cabin up there, don't. Because some doors, once opened, never truly close. I never understood why the fireplace in my rental cabin had been bricked up until I heard the voices coming from inside it. This happened last February, during one of the worst cold snaps to hit the Appalachian region in decades. I'd booked a cabin in West Virginia for a month-long riding retreat. The place was cheap, probably because it was the dead of winter and nobody wanted to be stuck in the mountains during a blizzard. The cabin was older, built in the 1940s, but it had been renovated. Modern kitchen, decent bathroom, and electric heating. The one odd thing was the fireplace in the main room. It had been sealed up with bricks and mortar, completely blocked off. When I asked the owner about it during check-in, he got this uncomfortable look on his face. Previous owner sealed it up, he said. Something about a bird's nest blocking the flue. Easier to just brick it over than fix it, I guess. It seemed like a waste of a good fireplace, especially during winter, but the electric heat worked fine, so I didn't push the issue. The first week went smoothly. I wrote during the day, made simple meals, and enjoyed the isolation. The snow started on day 8 and didn't stop. Within 2 days, there was 3 feet of accumulation, and the power lines went down. No electricity meant no heat. The temperature inside the cabin dropped fast. I bundled up in every layer I had and tried to wait it out. But by the second night without power, I was getting desperate. I kept looking at that bricked-up fireplace, thinking about the warmth it could provide. I found a sledgehammer in the shed outside and decided to break through the bricks. I'd pay for the repairs later. Freezing to death wasn't an option. The mortar was old and brittle, and the bricks came loose easier than I expected. Within an hour, I'd created a hole large enough to see into the fireplace cavity. I shined my flashlight inside, checking for the bird's nest the owner had mentioned. The chimney looked clear, no blockage at all. Just old soot-stained brick going up about 20 feet to where I could see a small square of gray sky. I cleared away the rest of the bricks and built a fire. The draw was perfect. The smoke went straight up, and within minutes, blessed heat was radiating into the room. I sat in front of it, warming my hands, grateful for the decision to open it up. That night I slept better than I had in days, the fire keeping the worst of the cold at bay. I woke up around 3 in the morning to add more wood to the fire. That's when I heard it. Whispering, quiet, distant whispering coming from inside the chimney. I froze, listening. It sounded like multiple voices, all talking at once, but too soft to make out words. The sound echoed down the brick shaft, distorted and strange. I leaned closer to the fireplace, trying to hear better. The whispering continued, rising and falling in rhythm. Maybe it was just the wind, I told myself. Wind moving through the chimney could create all kinds of weird sounds. I added wood to the fire and went back to bed, but the whispering continued. Now that I'd heard it, I couldn't unhear it. It went on for hours, just quiet enough that I couldn't quite make out what was being said. The next morning, the whispering stopped. I checked the chimney in daylight, shining a flashlight up the shaft. Nothing but bricks and old soot. No birds, no animals, no explanation for the sounds. That night, the whispering came back, but this time it was louder. I sat by the fire, listening carefully. There were definitely words, but they were overlapping. Multiple voices speaking different things at the same time, and they weren't speaking English. At least, I didn't think so. The language sounded old, guttural. Then one voice separated from the others. Clearer, closer, it said my name. I jumped back from the fireplace like I'd been burned. The voice had been clear, distinct, coming from deep inside the chimney. My name, spoken in a raspy whisper that echoed off the bricks. I stood there, heart pounding, staring at the dark opening of the fireplace. The other voices continued their overlapping chatter, but that one voice spoke again. We've been waiting. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it up the chimney. Nothing. Just empty darkness beyond the reach of the beam. "Who's there?" My voice came out shaky. The whispering stopped instantly. Complete silence. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Then all the voices spoke at once, loud and clear. "Let us out." I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't my imagination. Something was in that chimney, and it knew I was there. I should have bricked it back up right then, but it was still below freezing, and without the fire I wouldn't survive another night. So I made a choice that I regret every single day. I kept the fire going and tried to ignore the voices. They talked all night, sometimes whispering, sometimes louder, always overlapping, always in that strange language I couldn't understand, except for occasional phrases in English. "So cold. Let us out. We want to come down." I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner farthest from the fireplace with a blanket wrapped around me, watching the flames, listening to the voices echo down from above. When morning came, they stopped again. I walked over to the fireplace and looked up the chimney, exhausted and terrified. That's when I saw them. Faces. Dozens of pale faces pressed against the inside of the chimney, looking down at me. They were stacked on top of each other, clinging to the walls, their hollow eyes reflecting the firelight. I screamed and fell backward. When I looked again, they were gone. I ran outside into the snow, gasping for air, my mind trying to process what I'd just seen. But it was too cold. After 5 minutes, my fingers were numb and my face was burning from the wind. I had to go back inside. I spent that day trying to brick up the fireplace again, but I didn't have mortar. I stacked the bricks back in place, but without anything to hold them. They were just loose blocks that could easily be pushed over. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, I knew I had to light a fire again. I had no choice. I moved the bricks aside and built the smallest fire I could, just enough to keep from freezing. The whispering started immediately. But this time, it wasn't coming from up the chimney. It was coming from behind me. I spun around. The cabin was empty, but I could hear them clearly now. Whispering voices all around me, moving through the room. I felt cold air brush past my face like someone walking by. "Thank you for letting us out," a voice whispered directly in my ear. I pressed myself against the wall, looking around wildly. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel them. Presence. Multiple presences filling the cabin. The temperature dropped even further, despite the fire. I could see my breath now, even standing right next to the flames. The voices grew louder, excited, chattering in that strange language. Then the fire went out. Not gradually. It just died, like someone had thrown water on it. Complete darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hand shaking so badly I could barely press the button. When the beam finally came on, I swept it around the room. They were everywhere. Shadowy figures standing in corners, sitting in chairs, crowding around the fireplace. Some looked almost human, others were just dark shapes that hurt to look at. They all turned toward me when the light hit them, and they smiled. I don't remember much after that. I think I passed out. When I came to, it was morning, and the cabin was empty again. The fire was burning low, almost out. I packed everything I owned in 10 minutes and left. I didn't care about the snow or the roads. I drove down that mountain in 4-wheel drive, sliding and fishtailing the whole way. The power came back on that same day, I found out later. If I'd just waited one more night. But I know I made the right choice leaving. Because before I left, I looked at the bricks I'd stacked in front of the fireplace. They'd been pushed outward, scattered across the floor, and in the soot around the fireplace opening, there were handprints, dozens of handprints, small ones, large ones, all pressed into the ash like people had been crawling out of the chimney. I called the owner and told him what happened. He was quiet for a long time, then said, "So you opened it?" "You knew," I said. "You knew something was in there." "The previous owner sealed it for a reason," he said quietly. "There was a fire in that cabin back in the 60s. A family of 7 died. They were trying to shelter from a blizzard, and something went wrong with the chimney. It backdrafted. They all suffocated from the smoke, huddled around that fireplace. Why didn't you tell me? Would you have believed me?" He had a point. The cabin was demolished 3 months later. The owner said it was because of structural issues, but I know the truth. After I opened that chimney, other renters started reporting the same things. Voices, shadows, the fire going out on its own. One guest reported waking up to find soot-covered footprints leading from the fireplace to their bed. Small footprints, child-sized. I still hear the voices sometimes, especially on cold nights, whispering in my apartment vents, in the heating ducts, anywhere there's a passage for air. Last week, my building super knocked on my door. He said other tenants were complaining about whispering sounds coming from my apartment late at night. But I live alone, and my fireplace, the decorative gas one that came with the apartment, keeps turning itself on. I never turn it on. I won't. But every few days I come home to find it burning. And sometimes, if I look very closely at the flames, I can see faces in them, watching me, waiting.